So here's just some information on what we're going to be covering during our time today. So during our time today, we'll define pay equity and why it matters. We'll provide an overview of the key process steps for conducting a pay equity analysis. We'll share some questions to consider as you think about whether it's time for you to focus on the equity of equity compensation. We'll review the LTI landscape. We'll take you through 7 tips for analyzing the equity of equity compensation. And we'll end with some caveats about pay equity and total compensation. We'll also have time to hear from you and answer any questions that you may have. So first, let's define pay equity. At its core, pay equity is the practice of making sure that employee compensation is based on legitimate, non-discriminatory factors, things such as skill, effort, responsibility level, and working conditions. And if we want to think a little bit about why pay equity matters, first and foremost, it's a legal imperative. As you're probably aware and probably experiencing, there's been a host of new pay equity regulations and legislation over the past few years that has really dramatically increased the amount of compliance and reporting activities for employers. And then along with that legal imperative, there's also the ethical imperative to ensure that your employees are being paid fairly. And pay equity is also important in terms of attracting and retaining top talent and just more broadly, building a fair and equitable workplace. So before we get into our discussion of LTI more specifically, I do think it's worthwhile to spend some time discussing the key process steps for actually conducting a pay equity analysis. And this would hold for different pay outcomes, whether it's base pay, bonus, LTI, etc. So I like to break down the process of conducting a pay equity analysis into 5 steps. So the first step is to collect employee level data. And so typically this would be a snapshot of data as of a particular point in time. And of course, you'll want to collect compensation data. And you'll also want to collect demographic data, such as gender and race and ethnicity data. And the data should also include legitimate factors that you would expect to drive pay outcomes. So common examples of these legitimate factors are things like job or job function, career level, company tenure, time and position, performance rating, and there are a variety of other factors that you would legitimately expect to drive pay outcomes. So after you've collected the relevant data, the next step is to segment your workforce into what we call pay analysis groups. And segmentation is really driven by a few different considerations. And first and foremost, when you think about your segmentation, it should reflect differences in pay philosophy and pay practices within your organization. So it's really unique to your organization. For example, if you have sales employees, you may want to examine them separately from your non-sales workforce because they have very different pay practices in those 2 workforce segments. And another consideration should be the nature of the work that's actually being done. And this could be reflected in something like function, job function, job family, or lines of business. So you might want to segment further by function or by line of business, or in some cases by the combination of the 2. And then lastly, you'll want to consider geographic boundaries when determining your pay analysis groups. So for example, if you operate in multiple countries, you might want to segment by country, and then within country, you might want to segment by function or by line of business or by the combination of the 2. So once you've determined your pay analysis groups, the third step is really the sort of multiple regression analysis that you're going to be running. So you're going to be running a pay model for each of your pay analysis groups. And these models will include those legitimate factors that I mentioned earlier, the ones that you would expect to influence pay outcomes. So your models will include these legitimate factors as well as the demographic characteristics you're interested in examining. So it would include your legitimate factors plus things like gender and then race and ethnicity that would allow you to understand, after we've accounted for legitimate factors driving pay differences, do we see that gender or race and ethnicity or other demographic characteristics are related to compensation. So the fourth phase is what we call the assessment phase. And this is the part where you've run your regression analyses, and now you're actually determining, are there any unexplained pay differences by gender and race and ethnicity or any other protected demographic characteristics? So basically you run your regression analysis, you've accounted for as many legitimate drivers of pay differences as you are able to based on the data that you have available. And then after you've done that, do you actually see areas where we're seeing some sort of unexplained pay difference that seems to be related to gender or race or ethnicity or some other protected demographic characteristic? And then lastly, we have the remediation phase. And during the remediation phase, this is where you'll identify and review employees in those flagged groups. So in the assessment phase, we flagged groups where we are seeing some sort of issue perhaps related to some sort of inequity based on gender or race or ethnicity or some other protected demographic characteristic. And now you're going to actually be doing some remediating in those groups. So you're going to identify and review employees in these flagged groups who appear to be underpaid and make decisions around pay adjustments for them. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that not all employees that you identify for a pay adjustment will end up receiving an adjustment. When you're doing your remediation process, we recommend reviewing each of those flagged individuals on a case-by-case basis and determining if there's some legitimate reason that explains a specific employee's pay situation. And if there is no legitimate explanation, then it's recommended to adjust the employee's pay. And one thing to keep in mind is that when you're doing your remediation process and you're reviewing individual employees, you will identify reasons why someone should not be receiving a pay adjustment. And what we recommend that you do is you start tracking those reasons, and because that could be information that you want to, for example, collect going forward. So for example, if you find out that, a fairly sizable portion of the individuals that you flagged as potentially underpaid are underpaid because they don't have a particular skill or they don't have a particular certification that their peers have, that is information that you may want to begin tracking going forward. So that's an important part of that remediation process, is determining who should and should not receive an adjustment, and also tracking why, information that you might want to start collecting in the future that you can then incorporate into a future pay equity analysis. So most organizations, are conducting pay equity analyses focusing on base pay. In my experience, fewer are focusing on variable pay and very few are focusing on equity compensation. Although, as Bill is going to be sharing with you in a few minutes, LTI can in some cases constitute a pretty sizable percentage of compensation for some groups of employees. So these are a few questions that I'll ask you to consider as you think about whether it's time for you to conduct a pay equity analysis on your equity compensation. If you answer yes to these statements, then you may want to consider conducting a pay equity analysis of your long-term incentives. So the first question is, equity compensation plays an important role in your compensation strategy. The second question to consider is that equity compensation in your organization is not limited to your senior-most executives. So for example, your C-suite executives. And lastly, equity compensation decisions are not completely formulaic. That is, managers have some degree of discretion in making equity compensation decisions. And before I share tips for analyzing the equity of equity compensation, Bill is going to take us through the LTI landscape. So I'll hand it off to you, Bill.
Great. Thank you, Gail. So as Gail pointed out on this slide here, make sure we get to that slide. As Gail pointed out on that previous slide there, equity can play a very important role with respect to your compensation strategy. And I'd also add it does play an effective role in driving behaviors. But the key is that the long-term incentive plan or the equity plan has to be designed effectively. So we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how to design an effective long-term incentive plan, focusing on the inputs and the process and some of the key considerations. So when I consult with my organizations around developing a long-term incentive plan, it's important to get an understanding of what the company is trying to accomplish. And so I often spend time with the leadership team to understand some key considerations or guiding principles around 7 key areas there. But before we dive into those, I want to talk a little bit more about process. So when I do walk into the room, in an ideal world, I want to have more than just representation from 1 or 2 members of the management team. We want to hear from the entire management team, the entire leadership team when it comes to designing an LTI program, because they all bring different viewpoints when it comes to how to effectively design an LTI plan and what the company objectives are. You've certainly got different areas of the business that would be accounted for when you include a broader representation of that management team. And then one other item that I see for leading practices amongst my companies is getting a viewpoint below just the executive team. So identifying some of your high performers, conducting focus groups with them to understand what really motivates and incents them and what they think constitutes driving performance from the aspect of long-term incentives. And so circling back to the key features when it comes to, or key considerations when it comes to designing an equity compensation plan, first and foremost is the compensation philosophy. So the philosophy represents the anchor point for a lot of different decisions as it relates to compensation. First off, want to understand what are the overarching objectives of the organization? And then 2, where are you targeting compensation? So we tend to look at it by pay element, but also look at it in totality as well. And then finally, just identifying what is your comparator group or peer group. And that could be on the basis of who you compete with for talent or even customers as well. Next up, business strategy and objectives. And this is a really important one. So my companies, when we work on and try to build a long-term incentive plan, it's important to understand the long-term objectives of the organization. Because as we think about an equity or long-term incentive plan, naturally it's going to be focused on long-term. And when we think long-term, we think 3-4 years, give or take. That being said, we also think it's important to understand what are the short and midterm objectives as well. So you have a cohesive long-term incentive plan and cohesive incentive design in total. And really, this does, again, form the basis for what you're trying to develop. Next up is your company growth profile. So, I work with a number of different companies, some that are very much in early stage and ramping up. And so they have a tremendous trajectory in front of them. And what they would offer in terms of a long-term incentive vehicle is going to look very much different than a more mature company that is more steady growth. And so just understanding those different growth profiles and also understanding that the growth profile might change over time, which might dictate changes in the design of your long-term incentive plan. Another way of saying that long-term incentive plans are definitely not static. Next up, we'd want to understand, what do participants value? As I indicated as I kicked this off, wanted to understand more broadly what's important from the executive team, what's important more broadly in the organization. And the reason why we do this is, in my experience, there's no sense in implementing a long-term incentive program that participants don't understand, or it doesn't drive any behaviors. That doesn't really get to where we ultimately want to go. Next up is market practice. A lot of my organizations use this as a key reference point. And my advice to companies when they look at market practice, it's another data point to consider. It should not ultimately guide where you want to be. It's important to understand what your peers are doing, but it's okay to be different than your peers as long as there is a rationale for why we're doing something a little bit differently. But that being said, at the end of the day, when I think of the difference between strategy and market practice, strategy is going to always carry the day because that's really going to guide us forward. Next up, the impact of individual performance. So want to understand to what degree is like long-term incentive award opportunities differentiated based on individual performance. For a lot of my organizations, this is a key feature. They do differentiate based on performance. But before we dive into that, we typically want to make sure that the performance management system that's in place can support the differentiation that would be needed within the organization. I also have to say, I do have a handful of organizations that say, we're just going to do a guideline award to make it easy in the organization. And that's okay as well. But then again, you don't have that flexibility up or down to drive individual performance and accountability. And then finally, organizational alignment. One of the questions a lot of my organizations grapple with is, should the long-term incentive vehicles and the mix for the top executives be the same as those that are lower and cascade throughout the organization? And it's interesting because every one of my organizations has a very unique perspective on this. Some are very much one for all for one. Others recognize that it's important to differentiate. And part of it is just your company growth profile as well, where we definitely see larger, more mature organizations emphasize performance-based equity a little bit more, whereas some of the growth companies, we don't see that emphasized as much. And so just wanting to understand directionally where you want to go. So at the conclusion of talking about those 7 key considerations, we're able to identify what is our ideal design with respect to long-term incentives. But then we need to also understand, well, what are some of the factors that might influence what the design actually looks like? So one of the key components here is the overall size or headcount of the organization. And the limiting factor there is that oftentimes companies don't have a sufficient amount of shares or cash available if you want to roll it out broadly across the organization. And here's where it's important to understand where your organization might be unique or different from others. So I say that size is a limiting factor. If an organization is 20, 30,000 in headcount, you rarely see 100% participation in the organization, even though that might be desirable. Conversely, you might look at an organization that has 150 or 200 employees, and it's a lot easier to have the breadth of participation in there. And so you just need to understand what is feasible with respect to cash or equity. And then retention factors. A number of the organizations I work with, life sciences organizations, we have seen their share prices under pressure for 2 or 3 years now. And it has led to a steady decline in overall share prices. And so those that had previously granted stock options, there's just not a lot of value in the equity program. And so they have pivoted and changed because of the business strategy and what they're trying to accomplish to account for more of a retention-based award. So more time-based retention and restricted stock is one vehicle that they're emphasizing. Now, when the market turns in the life sciences space, we would expect to see that they're going to emphasize those growth vehicles a bit more. And then external perspectives, proxy advisory firms for publicly traded companies and the overall shareholder perspective, that really does shape a lot of the direction of organizations, oftentimes because you have to disclose it in a proxy statement. And so if you're going to go outside the lines a little bit, again, which is okay, you just need to have a really compelling rationale for why you do it, and you're going to want to talk about it. And then finally, kind of circling back to education and communication, in order for a plan to be effective, participants need to understand what it's trying to accomplish and the role that they can play in it. And oftentimes there is a fair amount of education and communication that are a part of that. So with that in mind, wanted to spend a little bit more time drilling down on some of the design specifics of the LTI program. And 2 things that I would encourage as we go through these, think about these as I'm talking about them. So 1, think about that ideal design that you had derived from discussions across the organization and really what you're trying to accomplish. And then 2, to emphasize what Gail said earlier, think about the internal equity of the program as well. Is there internal equity? And there's a number of different ways that you could look at it. but I encourage all my organizations to step back at the end of the day and look at it. So starting off with participation and eligibility, one of the things that my companies are really good at doing is defining who is eligible for annual awards and who is eligible for new hire awards. And most of my organizations have very bright line and specific eligibility requirements or determinations that they use. And the reason why they do that is they want to make sure that they are granting equity in a manner that is consistent. So again, this is another one of those areas where I think it's important, after you've determined eligibility, it's important to step back and look at who's receiving awards. So for example, all of your high performers, are they receiving equity awards? Is their range of adjustment upwards generally similar throughout the organization? And then also a level-based look at it. So is eligibility consistent throughout the organization, or are you seeing some levels or tracks that seem to be getting preferential treatment or not? So something that you'd want to look at before you kind of roll this out. Next up is targeted award opportunities. Oftentimes, my companies anchor the targeted award opportunities in the compensation philosophy. That being said, a philosophy is intended to be a guidepost. And therefore, there might be reasons that you might want to go above or beyond a philosophy. So let's start with the above. Some of my organizations, in a year that they've had outperformance, they want to reward the employees when it comes to what the target award opportunities look like. And so year over year, they might deviate from their compensation philosophy. And instead of providing a 50th percentile award, they provide a 75th percentile award across the board. Conversely, with some of my organizations where they are challenged either by share availability or their share price or performance has been less than ideal, they might need to pull back on what the targeted award opportunities look like. But at the end of the day, when we look at that, want to make sure that there's a consistent application. Also, when we talk about targeted award opportunities, want to make sure that we are, if we do have an individual performance modifier in there, are we applying it consistently? And so that's another opportunity before we make the individual grants to really dig in on how we are allocating awards to individuals, and are we doing it in a consistent way? And then finally, with respect to the mix of compensation, again, want to step back and look at the overall mix. How does the percentage of compensation delivered in LTI for each level within the organization change? And does it cascade appropriately? Next up, want to spend a little bit of time talking about long-term incentive vehicles. As I indicated when we had talked about growth profiles, long-term incentive vehicles are very closely aligned to what the company is trying to accomplish and very much aligned to the profile and strategy of the organization. Oftentimes, you're going to see industries definitely tend to move in a pack when it comes to the type of LTI vehicles that are granted. And I think that market reference point is important. That being said, I always encourage my companies to step back and look at their profile and how it might differ from some of their peers. And then look at, okay, is our long-term incentive vehicles aligned with our profile and our strategy? And on top of that, how do we want to differentiate for the top executives of the organization versus some of the other employees? Should it be universal all the way down? So let's say everybody receives 75% options and 25% RSUs. Or do we want to tilt the mix lower in the organization to focus more on restricted stock units? And part of that is just the overall viewpoint on contributions within the organizations, but also just a culture. Do we want to have a uniform approach to long-term incentives? And then, I said, what is the right vehicle mix? Well, this is going to be unique. And to be honest, there's no right answer to this. It's very much based on your profile and what you're trying to drive, but also being mindful of what the market is doing as well. And so finally, vesting. Vesting is generally pretty straightforward. Most of the organizations I work with vest equity awards either over 3 or 4 years. But there might be some unique circumstances that you might want to shorten the vesting period for equity awards. So for example, if you're not able to provide a full opportunity for whatever reason, one of the uh, alternatives my companies do is they shorten the vesting a little bit. So they're able to deliver more value quickly. So we need to be mindful of what is the overall retention within the organization. So with that in mind, that's a little bit of the backdrop there. And again, just want to circle back. And one final thing is, again, as you evaluate the design of your program, think about the overall objectives that you had set forth in your ideal design. And then also think about, are you applying the long-term incentive program consistently throughout the organization? And is there internal equity? So next, we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about LTI market data and just emphasizing a few of the points that we had spoken about earlier. So first off, let's talk about LTI eligibility. What we have here is an all industry perspective. And so one of the things I'm going to encourage you, and you'll see it on the next page when we get to it, is very rarely do I encourage a company to take this all industry look when it comes to eligibility, because it is significantly different across other industries. That being said, there's a lot of key tenets that tend to follow along here. So generally, when it comes to LTI eligibility, you're going to have generally pretty high participation from the executive team. Now, we show 70 to 75% eligibility. And a part of that is it's not 100%, but the reason being is not every company grants equity every year. You've got some privately held organizations that do not grant equity every year and therefore might not be eligible every year. But by and large, across all public companies, let's say most everybody from the executive ranks is eligible every year. And then if you look at the way the top of the management team or the top of the professional or top of the scientific tracks, you're seeing very broad participation and eligibility with respect to LTI. So 65% and greater tends to participate. But then you see, as you cascade lower in the organization, it drops off pretty quickly in terms of what LTI eligibility looks like. And the reason why that is the core idea behind long-term incentives is, one, aligning with the organization's long-term performance, and two, ideally, you're trying to have people that contribute to the go-forward performance of the organization. And so at the end of the day, you might see some of the lower levels within an organization. Perhaps eligibility isn't quite as broad, but where you might see eligibility is really with those high-performing individuals. So this is the broad perspective. Now, what I would encourage all of my organizations to do is take a very specific industry look when you look at employee eligibility. So, as we've heard for many, many years, technology companies, just culturally, there is a very high level of participation in the LTI program. Same with pre-commercial biopharma companies. So these are development stage biopharma companies. 81% of companies on average are eligible to participate. Now, I work with a number of these companies, and generally what you see is the headcount of these organizations is, we're going to call it 50 to 200 employees. And so when you think about 80% of 200 employees participating, 200 is generally a pretty modest number. And so there is availability of equity awards available to grant to them. But then if you flip over two bars and think about commercial stage biopharma, where generally headcounts are larger, you see that decline in participation. So only about 64% of employees participate there. So that's one end of the spectrum. Move to the other end of the spectrum, aerospace and defense, building materials, and restaurants. Generally, you have very high headcounts with respect to a lot of the companies in those industries. In addition, you do have generally a high number of hourly employees that generally do not participate in the program. And so you see that when you look at the broadness and the number of employees that participate relative to those headcounts, it's a pretty small number. So again, the key takeaway is focus on the eligibility within your specific industry. Next up, I want to spend some time on percent of compensation delivered in LTI. And again, part of this is driven by just overall market practice, but two is the core principle is ability to influence outcomes and long-term performance. And so naturally, you're going to see top executives have a large part, even a majority of their compensation delivered in LTI, 45 to 70%, depending on what level you're at. But even at lower levels of the organization for the executive population, you still see 30 to 45% delivered in LTI. And you see that cascade also through to the top levels of management, professional, technical, scientific, as they have a tremendous impact on what overall performance is. And then lower in the organization, you just generally see more of an emphasis on cash compensation and a bit less on LTI. And then the final bit of information that we wanted to provide is just sharing some LTI data on equity vehicle eligibility. So what we have observed over the past several years is that restricted stock is very much the vehicle of preference. The reason being is it's straightforward and easy to understand. Generally, participants understand if I give you a share of restricted stock and you stick around for a year, you get that share of restricted stock and it has a concrete value. When it comes to stock options and how to size options and how to exercise an options, it's a bit less clear to participants on how to do it. And then when we think about performance shares, generally those are limited to just the top of the house. So those key executives that drive long-term performance, significantly more complex, and there's anchors that go up and down with respect to what payouts look like with respect to performance shares. So a little bit more complex. But at the end of the day, when it comes to vehicle eligibility, participation is key, but also just a really good understanding of how to drive performance forward, because that makes for an effective plan. And so with that, I'm going to flip it back over to Gail, who's going to talk a little bit about the 7 tips for analyzing the equity compensation.
Thanks so much, Bill. So as Bill mentioned, I'm going to just give you some hopefully useful tips. And if you think about analyzing the equity compensation for your organization. So our first tip is to focus on the value or the amount of the equity award on the grant date. So whether you're using, like a stock-based equity, like restricted stock or performance shares, or an appreciation-based equity, like stock options and stock appreciation rights, once equity is granted, its value will likely change. And while this value changing over time, of course, it matters a great deal to your employees because it directly impacts their compensation. But what happens to the value of the equity award after the grant date is pretty much out of the manager's control. So when we think about a pay equity perspective, we recommend focusing on the value or the amount of the equity award on the grant date. One, because it's easy to measure, as Bill was saying earlier, restricted stock, performance shares, they have a known value on the grant date. And the amount of stock options and stock appreciation rights awarded on the grant date is also known. And secondly, it's anchored in your company's compensation philosophy. So your philosophy is really your strategic plan for how you make compensation decisions. So as an example, let's say we have a company with a strong pay for performance philosophy, and they might grant equity of a specific value for hitting a specific financial target. So the target and the value are aligned on the grant date, but after that date, the two may diverge as the award value changes. And lastly, if we focus on the value on the actual grant date, that is really what reflects the manager's intention in terms of how much they intended to reward an employee. So our second tip is to examine different categories and types of equity awards separately. So it's common for companies to have different guidelines for different categories of equity compensation. So, and by different categories, we mean things like new hire grants, annual refresher grants, retention grants. And since these guidelines differ, we recommend examining each category of equity awards separately. And the same can be said of different types of equity awards. And by equity type, I mean awards like restricted stock, performance shares, stock options, stock appreciation rights. So for some equity award types, the relevant, compensation metric is really the value of the award on the grant date, such as restricted stock and performance shares, while for others, the relevant metric is a number, right? The number of stock options granted or the number of stock appreciation rights awarded. And since the relevant, compensation metric differs depending on the type of award, we recommend examining different equity award types separately. So our third tip is that when you're looking specifically at your annual refresher equity grants, we recommend examining proposed equity awards and making remedial adjustments before finalizing. So if you think about base pay is cumulative and can really be adjusted at any time to address any kind of pay inequity that you may have unearthed during some, pay equity review. On the other hand, variable pay typically resets at the beginning of a period. And once variable payouts have been awarded to employees, it's pretty difficult, either from an administrative point of view, as well as from an optics perspective, to adjust them after the fact, after they've been awarded. So for these reasons, we recommend remediating inequities in those annual refresher equity grants by analyzing the proposed equity award and adjusting these prior to the award being finalized. Now, and this is a best practice, but it's important to keep in mind that timing is very important if you want to evaluate your proposed equity awards. So to really make this process work, you need to basically conduct a pay equity analysis of proposed equity awards and decide on any kind of remedial adjustments in between the time managers enter proposed amounts into the system and the time the system closes. And for some organizations, the time between these two activities, the system opening, closing to managers, and the system, being final and totally closed, that can be as little as a week, right? Now, some organizations, if you're lucky, maybe you have an extra couple of weeks to do that. So we do recommend working with these proposed equity awards and adjusting these proposed amounts before they're finalized, but we recognize that doing so can be difficult in terms of timing. So that actually leads us to our fourth tip. So our fourth tip is to start with what we call a foundational analysis of the annual refresher equity awards. So if you want to analyze proposed equity awards, as we just talked about, and we think an important first step is to actually conduct a precursory or foundational pay equity analysis in advance of your compensation process. And for this foundational analysis, you can actually use your past equity awards to basically get started on your pay equity analysis. So you would basically conduct the first 3 steps of a pay equity analysis. And as you'll recall from our discussion earlier, so the first 3 steps are collecting the relevant data, segmenting your workforce into pay analysis groups, and then in this case, developing an equity compensation model for each of your pay analysis groups. Once you've completed this foundational work, you can then rerun the regression analysis using updated data. So you're basically getting started on the work, kind of getting yourself situated, and then getting new data that reflects the proposed, the proposed equity awards. Then you can quickly rerun the analysis and identify any areas of concern and make remedial adjustments to those proposed equity awards. But this does require some dedication to making sure that you have everything timed out, to optimally to make sure it works. But once you get that process down, and once you've done it a couple of times, you just embed it into your overarching process for determining LTI awards. So our 5th tip is focusing on new hire equity awards and retention grants. And basically our tip here is that, those need to be examined differently than what we just talked about in terms of the annual refresher awards. So when you think about the annual refresher equity awards, they're typically granted at specific times during the year. And so because of this, the process makes it possible for you to examine a proposed equity award before they're finalized. But other types of grants, such as new hire grants and retention grants, are awarded pretty much only as needed. And so it's impractical to work with proposed grants for these grant types. Instead, what we recommend to mitigate any kind of inequity or potential bias, we recommend kind of putting in place some fairly reasonable processes and procedures that your managers would follow when making these grant awards. So for new hire grants, we recommend comparing a proposed new hire grant to the average of recent new hire grants for similar roles, because that's information that's pretty easy to acquire, right? So when you have a proposed new hire grant for a candidate, looking at the most recent, let's say over the last 12 months, the recent new hire grants for similar roles is pretty easy to compare the two. And if you see a difference of a certain percentage or greater, and this is discretionary in terms of what that percentage difference would be. I have 10% listed here, but that's really something that each company would want to determine on their own. You would then ask the hiring manager for an explanation. So ask them, why is it that you've decided to give this new hire grant a grant 10% higher or 15 or 20% higher than the average that we've seen for similar roles over the last 12 months. And there are legitimate cases in which you might expect a new hire grant to be greater than the company norm, but you want to vet these explanations. So just as a common example, in some cases when you bring someone in, you need to buy out a job candidate's unvested equity, and that could easily lead you to giving them a new hire grant that exceeds sort of the typical for others in a similar role. And when you're looking at retention grants, we recommend asking the manager for an explanation for the grant, and on top of that, to help ensure there's no bias in who's actually receiving a retention grant, we recommend asking why other similar employees reporting to that same manager are not receiving a grant. So our sixth tip is about technology. So it's basically our recommendation to use technology to help decision makers make equitable equity compensation decisions. So every time a compensation decision is made, it's really an opportunity to hopefully help prevent, but it could also potentially exacerbate a pay inequity. And technology can help decision makers, and this could be your managers, it could be recruiters, with the information that they need to help them make equitable equity compensation decisions. For example, if you, depending on the software, you can actually see provide decision makers with recent equity awards, so they can very easily compare the equity awards that they're thinking of making to recent equity awards. It could also include the company's guidelines. And depending on the implementation, the software can also include a recommended equity award for a specific individual based on internal equity. So it can say, based on this individual's, let's say, their performance, where they sit in the organization, their level, et cetera, we would expect their equity award to be, between A and B. And this is the amount, this, range is the amount that is consistent with internal equity. And then ask them to, work within that range. And if they decide to go outside of that range, ask them for an explanation for why they've decided to do that. And software can be particularly helpful when equity decisions need to be made quickly, which particularly during the annual refresher grant, when there's a lot of decisions being made during a fairly short period of time. And then our seventh tip, if equity awards are formulaic, which they might be for your organization, we're recommending ensuring that the components of the formula are equitable. So if you have a formulaic equity compensation program, it generally leaves fairly little room for manager discretion, but the formula itself could be subject to bias. So if your company's equity awards are completely formula driven, For example, let's say this is an example where it's a combination of career level and performance rating. Those are the two things, and two things alone, that determine your equity award. We wouldn't recommend examining the equity of the equity award directly. Instead, we would recommend looking for inequities in the formula. So in this example, we recommend ensuring that base pay and performance rating are equitable, since these are what actually determine an employee's equity award. So we would recommend running a pay equity analysis on base pay to ensure that base pay is equitable, and conducting a performance rating assessment to ensure there's no bias in performance ratings. So before we close, we just wanted to share some caveats about examining total compensation. Many organizations out there have a total compensation philosophy, and it might seem quite reasonable to conduct a pay equity analysis on a measure of total compensation, whether that's total cash compensation or total direct compensation. But if you choose to do that, I just wanted to point out a couple of caveats to keep in mind. So when you run a pay equity analysis on total compensation, just keep in mind that the results are informational, but not directly actionable. So let's say you run an analysis of total compensation and it reveals some sort of inequity. Well, the analysis doesn't tell you, it provides no guidance regarding what element of pay should be adjusted. So if you find an inequity in total compensation, do you adjust base pay, your bonus, equity? And what I've seen some organizations do is that they might adjust whichever element of total compensation is really most convenient. But we don't recommend this approach. So as an example, if you determine that a particular employee has a $10,000 compensation inequity, the employee is certainly not indifferent between receiving a $10,000 salary adjustment, a $10,000 one-time bonus, or a $10,000 equity award to close that inequity. So if you'd like to examine total compensation, what we recommend is that you examine each component of total compensation individually and remediate each component of pay separately. So thank you so much for your time today. And we certainly have a few minutes to answer any questions that you have. So I'll turn it over to Pauline for the Q&A part of the session.
Awesome. And just really quickly before we jump into the Q&A, I'm just going to take a moment and give everyone an opportunity to select if they'd like to meet with a Trusaic expert and discuss your organization's unique needs and challenges. So I'll leave that open a little bit longer as we jump into the Q&A. So the first question we have on the Q&A is, do these tips apply to LTI in a privately held company?
That is a great question. Yes, absolutely. Right. So there might be differences in the kind of vehicle type that, and I think Bill kind of spoke to this. So you might have different types of LTI vehicles in a private company versus a public company, but all of the tips that we shared would apply equally well in a private company. And actually, they also would apply for a short-term incentive. So if you wanted to analyze bonus pay, I would say these tips would also be equally useful for that as well.
Right. Yeah. And maybe just to add on to that, I think it's important certainly for private companies. A lot of the private companies I work with are generally small. I've got a couple large ones, but they're thinking of going public at some time in the future. I think one of the things my private companies struggle with is, how do you reward from an equity perspective those people that have been with the organization for an extended period of time versus those that are newer to the organization? And so it's important to recognize, you've got benchmark data, but also there's a lot more that goes into it than just looking at the benchmark data. And so it's important to calibrate when you're determining a new hire coming aboard and what to provide them in a private setting, how their equity award should compare to somebody that has been with the organization for 3, 4, 5 years.
Awesome. And then another question that came in, when conducting these analyses in preparation for grants, is there a concern about doing this not under attorney-client privilege? So budgetary issues are often a barrier to making the necessary equitable adjustments.
I would say that anytime you do a pay equity analysis, you want to speak to your counsel about whether or not the work should be privileged. There's no reason that at least parts of the work can't be done, through counsel and remain, to the extent possible, privileged and confidential. So I would most definitely, if this is not something you've done before, I would first reach out to your internal counsel to find out what they would recommend.
Great. And this question came in a little bit earlier. What if certification is not required in the minimum qualifications?
Oh, I'm assuming this is speaking to like the legitimate factors driving pay differences. So when you think about pay equity, it's really an internal benchmark. So if you have a group of employees where all of them have a particular certification, except one person or except two people, let's say, and the company provides a premium to people with that certification, then the analysis could easily pick up that these two individuals are quote unquote underpaid if the analysis doesn't directly account for the other individuals having a particular certification. So even though a certification may not be like even part of the minimum requirement for the role, if it is something that the company actually rewards, so if somebody gets a certification and they get a pay bump of $5,000 a year, that is going to turn up when you're basically running a pay equity analysis, because you're looking at an internal benchmark. You're comparing people to each other, and ideally, in an ideal world, you could account for that in your regression analysis by including that as a legitimate factor to say that individual A or individual B has this particular certification, and that way you basically are accounting for it as part of your analysis. But a lot of organizations don't track that information directly. So that's something that they would have to account for on the back end when people without that certification get flagged for review. And when those individuals are flagged for a review, you could then say, we're not going to give these two individuals an adjustment because they don't have this particular certification that their peers have. And their peers have received, this $5,000 a year bonus because they have that certification.
Great. Thank you for that, Gail. Next question is, you mentioned the importance of differentiating compensation philosophies for complex, high-growth companies. What are some effective strategies or best practices for transforming privately held companies to publicly traded status when it comes to executive compensation and incentive plan design?
Right. Yeah. So I could take this one. So yeah, the transition from privately held to publicly traded for a lot of organizations is very much a sea change when it comes to the design of long-term incentive programs. Oftentimes, the amount of complexity could be a lot greater with respect to moving to that public company. And part of it is driven by just understanding what your competitors are doing and what the market for talent is doing. And so oftentimes when I'm working with companies to do this, we do want to understand what the market is, but we also want to understand what are the company's objectives and what are we trying to do. And then just overall, if we do make a change from what we've previously granted in terms of vehicles, how much communication is needed and education needed for employees to make sure that they understand any potential changes. And so, part of the design is, really understanding the go-forward organization, but a big part of it is just understanding the profile of your employees and helping them better understand the changes that will ensue with moving from private to public. But make no mistake, it often is quite a difference in just the overall way compensation is delivered.